Hello, everyone. This is Jake Smeester, a creative content specialist for Amazon Sumerian, and I'm here very close with Ben Moore.
Very close. A little too close. But hey, everyone. Glad to be back.
Well, you might be wondering why we are sitting next to each other. It's partly because, well, the only reason why we're sitting this close to each other is because we have another guest with us, Mike Starr, who's really our AR expert, I would say, right?
Oh, he's definitely our AR expert.
All right.
That's very generous. Thanks.
Here's Mike. There we go. Pass it over to Mike. Here's Mike. He is our software development engineer, and he's going to be walking through us today how to use AR using Amazon Sumerian. I'll jump back over to ourselves over here. And so, yeah, what we're going to be covering today is AR and how you create those applications using Sumerian. And Mike is going to be walking through the basics of using AR Kit and AR Core, all starting with Sumerian on the Sumerian side. And yeah, that's the main thing. I don't actually have a title. There's not a lot of room up here for our titles.
Okay.
But what we're going to be talking about today. But that's it.
Just
AR.
A couple of reminders as usual. Dev community, go to slack.sumerian.world. Jake will throw up his infographic there so you guys can see it. Great place to speak with engineers that are on the Sumerian team. You can also find Jake and myself on there. We'll also be monitoring the Twitch chat live. I am Jammin' Moo on Twitch chat, and so if you have any questions, please feel free to direct them towards me. Or Jake himself is on there as well.
Yeah, we're both going to be here, and we're just kind of doing this first time of three people in the studio. So we're very glad you joined us. This is our 8th episode of the Introduction to Sumerian. Did I say 8th? I think it's 9th. 9th episode. Last week we covered virtual reality. This week we're covering augmented reality or AR. And next week we're going to do kind of a longer broadcast where we just bring it all together and we create a larger, useful scene, and we can actually add it into VR. So that's what we're going to be doing next week. But for this week, let's get going with Mike on AR. All right, Mike, I'm going to pass it over to you. And your screen. Okay, there we go.
All right. So what I'm going to do here is, at a high level, just walk through these 2 tutorials that we have up on our doc site around using Sumerian in conjunction with AR Kit and AR Core, which, if you're not familiar, are the mobile frameworks, the frameworks that Apple and Google have provided on mobile devices that developers can use to create AR or AR experiences. So
we're just added those also to the chat room, so they're there for everybody.
So if you've ever seen, like, I think the IKEA app is the big one on mobile phones that let you like grab furniture and place it around your house. What we're going for, what we're trying to demonstrate is something like that, where we take an object that you've created in Sumerian and we use those APIs to place that object somewhere in the world.
So, Mike, just a quick question: are you talking about marker-based AR or markerless?
So we're talking about markerless AR. Both AR Kit and AR Core they don't use the physical markers that you might have seen. I think in the very early iterations of AR, the only way it worked really was you'd have something printed out on a piece of paper, usually rectangular, that the camera would pick up on and sort of generate its perception of the world off of that image, and you could put content on top of that. So AR Kit and AR Core don't work like that. What they're doing is they're essentially using all the sensors on your phone or tablet to generate like an internal representation of the real world. So they're using both the camera to try and pick out surfaces and the accelerometer to figure out movement through the world. And like the end result of that is that they can give you back pieces of geometry that they've detected in the real world, and usually those come back as planes. So the APIs will pick up like the plane that represents the floor or your desk or a book or things like that. Like flat, square surfaces or rectangular surfaces are generally what they're best at picking up. so those frameworks also give you the ability to do what's called a hit test. And all that really is a query into the world based on like a certain point of the screen. So you'll be able to, they give you the ability to tap on the screen and translate that coordinate in screen space into 3D space, into the model that those frameworks have created of the world. So basically what that means is you tap on your desk and it will give you back a point in 3D space that represents that point on your desk. And given that point, you can create what are called anchors, which is really just a fancy way of saying or telling those frameworks to track that point for you over time. And on the Sumerian side, what we'll be doing is attaching objects to those anchors so that they stay in the same position in the world.
Cool.
So that's like a high-level overview of the frameworks on the mobile devices, on what they do. I haven't really talked about how that hooks up to Sumerian. So as we get into this, we're going to go into like a very small amount of app development. And like to get this working, we'll actually have to build our own mobile apps to host the scene. And the reason for doing that is that these frameworks, ARKit and ARCore, are only accessible on the native level. So unfortunately, you can't just open up mobile Safari or mobile Android and load a Sumerian scene and get access to those frameworks. That's just not the way it's implemented. There's no support for that yet. So because that's the case, we have to sort of jump through the hoop of creating our own app and using some of the functionality that we've built that allows ARKit and ARCore to talk to your Sumerian scene. So I think I'll just start by where the tutorials start. So regardless of where you want to view this experience again, whether it's Android or iOS, the path in Sumerian is the same for both. So you can publish the scene once, and it doesn't matter whether you're using the Android app or the iOS app. You don't have to do anything special in Sumerian. So I think I'm going to start here by opening up Sumerian and choosing this augmented reality template. And I'm just going to create a test scene based off of that.
And Mike, is this template specific to a particular platform?
What do you mean by platform?
Well, so is it iOS specific?
Oh
or
no,
Android specific?
no. So it doesn't matter. On the Sumerian side, you don't have to take into account whether you want this to end up on iOS or Android. The same scene should work for both.
All right. So build once, deploy anywhere type concept.
Yeah, or for any other future platforms that we add support for. So I have a scene created from this template, and so it's a pretty basic empty scene. There's only a few things different. So you'll notice if you dig into the environment panel on the right here that there's no skybox, and the background is set to transparent. And the reason that's the case is just because we need to be able to see through the scene when it's overlaid on top of a camera image. And if there's a skybox or if the background was a solid color, then you wouldn't be able to do that. So the scene would still work, you just wouldn't see the camera image, which would obviously not be good for the whole AR illusion.
Is that a major difference between creating an AR and VR scene?
Yeah. So that's something, if you were to build the scene from an empty thing manually, or from an empty template manually, you'd have to do yourself. But if you just use the AR template, it's already built in there. So, or those settings are already set for you, so you just don't have to worry about it. So the next thing that's different is that you'll see this AR camera entity, and all this is a normal camera with a script attached to it, and the script connects to the code we've written to interface with ARKit and ARCore on the mobile device. So the script on this camera is what's picking up the information that the frameworks on the device are giving us. And again, you don't really have to touch that. That just once you publish your scene and load it up through these apps, that the camera control just works for you. If you're interested, you can certainly dig into like the code in the script. It's not super complicated, but it's not something that you would really have to understand if you didn't want to. So other than that, so there's this air anchor entity in here that we're not going to worry about yet. And then just a camera and lights. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to import an asset that we want to view in AR. I think Jake wanted me to use the mannequin, so I'll respect your wishes. Is my import asset button not working? No, there we go.
The reason why I asked Mike to use the mannequin is because one of the issues, at least with as we're just broadcasting, it's kind of hard to show in Amazon or an AR app like on screen, and so I have a video that we're going to kind of show later of what you can do, what you can actually do using the mannequin. So anyway, we're just getting some consistency, but really you can add any entity you want in there. So he's just using the mannequin just as an example.
Am I back? All right.
Yeah, you're good.
So I'm just going to double click on this mannequin and get it into my asset bin, and then drag that. Maybe the entity. There we go. Trackpad doesn't like me. All right, when that loads up, theoretically. Okay, great. So we have a mannequin in the scene. And so the next step here is, so if you have no desire to actually move objects around in the space, then you're basically done. But it doesn't really make for a particularly interesting experience. So as a first step here, we're just going to publish the scene. We'll hit view. And all I'm doing is grabbing the URL of the published scene here. So this URL, after you published, you want to grab that, and I think as the tutorials say, that so the next step is to take the URL of our published scene and feed that into an app that we've created that will load that scene and hook up all the AR APIs on the native device. So this is where things branch, depending on whether you want to build an iOS or an Android app.
Mike, real quick, before you get into that, can you explain a little bit about, on the Sumerian side, what is going on with, like, there's a transparent background and why that's important, and just at least explain the transparent background. Let's see if we have any other.
So the transparent background just exists so that you can see through the scene to the camera image behind it. So what the apps are doing is they're overlaying the Sumerian scene on top of a camera, on top of the device camera image that's rendered natively, and so you need the background on the scene to be transparent. Otherwise, it will occlude the background, and you'll just see the Sumerian scene and not the camera. Yeah? Okay. So I think now what I'm going to do is move into the app side of things. So on the Sumerian side, we've created our really basic AR scene, and we published it, and we have the URL for that. So we have our content created, and now the next step is to figure out how we're going to view it in these mobile apps. So where am I here? All right. So the tutorials at this point will link you to projects that are hosted in GitHub. And if you're not familiar with that, GitHub is just a sort of like a community code hosting site that uses the Git version control system. So it's just a sort of public repository for code that people have created and want to share with other people. And it does version tracking and all kinds of other fancy stuff. So for the on the iOS side, we've published a project up here called Amazon Sumerian AR Kit Starter App. And what this is an Xcode project, which is, if you're at all familiar with iOS development, it's the Xcode is Apple's IDE, their system that lets developers build apps for those platforms. So we've created an Xcode project that does most of the work for you in terms of interacting with the ARKit framework on the device and getting the information it needs out of that. So what you would want to do here is hit the GitHub URL that we have in the tutorial, and I'm sure Jake can post that in the chat at some point.
You got it.
You're way ahead of me. All right. So what you want to do there, if you're not familiar with Git, there's a couple, or GitHub, there's a couple different ways you can pull the project. I'd say the way I recommend is to actually use Git. And if you hit this clone or download button, and this button, it'll copy this URL for you. You can also just hit download zip, and it will download the most recent version of the project for you. The reason you'd want to use Git and the URL is because it just makes it more easy to update if we push changes. So once you have that URL, you just jump over to a terminal in either like Windows, Mac, whatever you're using, and just type git clone and then throw that URL in there. I'm not actually going to hit enter because I already have it downloaded, but basically that will just pull the project from that site and store it in a local directory. And again, if you're not comfortable, if you don't feel like learning Git to do this, you can just download. You can just hit download zip and it'll pull the project for you. So once you have that locally, what you want to do is navigate to the directory where the project downloaded. So I'm in the Amazon Sumerian ARKit Starter App directory, and there's a file in here called of the same name with the Xcode project extension, and you just want to double click on that, and it will. Again, I'm not going to do it because I already have it open, but it will just open in Xcode, which is again, Apple's IDE for developing apps. So if you've ever developed an iPhone app, if you ever used an app on the iPhone, somebody used this to develop it. So this is a pretty simple project. There's only 4 or 5 files. The first thing you'll probably have to do is, if you go into your global project settings under the ARKit Starter Target, you'll probably have to switch this development team to something that's your name and not my name. And if it complains about not being able to find a certificate or something like that, usually you can just change the bundle ID to something else. I would put like your name in there instead of Amazon. And that, like, all that stuff's just related to how they deal with signing and maintaining apps on Apple's end. So usually you just have to sort of mess with those settings a little bit to get it to build. And if you're curious, you can certainly look through all the code in here. There's only the only files that are super interesting are this viewcontroller.swift file, which is the main entry point for the program, and Sumerian connector.swift, which handles talking to both the ARKit framework and the Sumerian scene that it's hosted. So anyway, the fastest way to get this to work here is you're really the bare minimum you've got to do here is take this scene URL variable at the top of viewcontroller and change that to be the URL to the scene you just published. So I'm just going to duplicate it and go back to my scene. And I'm just grabbing the URL of the published scene. Whoa. Oh, never mind that. Okay, so I have the URL of the published scene, and I'm just going to paste it in here and replace the URL that's there. It's very important that that the trailing part of the URL has / AR mode equal true. And so that little flag on the end of the URL is necessary because when we're displaying a published scene, we need to know there's certain options we set on the canvas that will vary based on whether the scene is meant to be viewed in an AR context or a normal context. So it again related to the transparent background thing. In most cases, for scenes that aren't aren't being displayed in AR, there's no reason to set all that transparency stuff. It can cost you a little bit in terms of having to do alpha blending in cases where it's not really necessary. But for AR, in the AR experience, it is necessary. So we need to inform the scene in some way that it needs to do those things. So we've got our URL in there, and that's the only thing we need to change to get the basic experience working in this app. So if you're not into app development, if this is intimidating or you don't feel like dealing with it, that's the bare minimum is done. And then you just hit that build button. And so if I was able to show you the iPad that it's building to, you would see the app loading up. I suppose I should unlock it. So it's building or running.
So, quick question. Is Xcode the only option for building an AR iOS app?
An AR iOS app, yes. It is the only way to do it right now. So if we're talking about non-marker based AR, using ARKit, you absolutely have to use Xcode. There's no way around using an app unless you want to build your own AR framework in JavaScript in the browser. But we don't really have that.
Gotcha. Cool. Thanks.
And so this was brought up earlier too, is if you only own a PC, Xcode is not available on a PC. So if you Google Xcode for Windows, there are a lot of options of how you might get around that. But like Mike said, it is absolutely necessary to use Xcode to build a ARKit-based iOS AR application.
Yeah, Xcode and a Mac are pretty much mandatory. On the AR core side, the Android variant, you can use Windows or Mac or Linux, I think, because Android Studio is a little bit more portable. But on the iOS side, you're pretty much stuck on having to use a Mac.
Gotcha. Okay.
So the app is loaded. I don't really have a great way of showing it to you. But the scene loads much as it does on a normal. I have no idea how this will work or not.
If this doesn't work, we will show you a quick video of it working.
Yeah, you should.
In real life.
You should probably go to that. I don't think
Okay,
we're
we'll
gonna
just go to that. All right, so what we have here is we've already done this before, and this is actually, we tweeted out the same video, but we just built a AR application using Sumerian, and then we created one on an iPad, I think the same iPad, and we just went to the Spheres here in Seattle, and we just actually started placing the mannequin around. And the one difference we did between what Mike has done and what we did in this video is that we added some animations and stuff happened. So, and you can do this. You can add all the animations, you can add state machine, you can do everything you want to do as you would in Sumerian and just deploy it as an AR app. And so those are the slight differences. But let me switch over to the video so you can see this is another coworker using the same app in the Spheres. So we're going to play that. So you can see he's just, the mannequin is obviously not there, but he's placed it in front of him. He's moving around from side to side. You see the mannequin, and we'll play that one more time. Actually, I need to switch out and go back into it. There we go. So you see the animations happening. You see him moving. The mannequin is staying in place no matter the position that he has. He moves it around, and the mannequin is stuck in the same position. Okay, cool. All right, we're back to you, Mike.
Okay, so that I think that video is a pretty good demonstration of the basic functionality, so that's essentially what would have happened if I was able to show you the iPad that I just built the scene to. So we can. So at that point, you're able to view an object in AR, but to make things useful and interesting, we probably want the ability to position, rotate, scale objects, and have a little bit more control over where they're placed in the real world. So to do that, and this is where the tutorials sort of jumps into the more advanced mode, is that we need to use the script APIs that we've exposed on the AR system in Sumerian. And so what these APIs let you do is, through scripting, use that hit test functionality that I spoke about earlier. So the ability to really query into the world and get back real world positions that correspond to detected surfaces. So like a point on your desk or a point on the floor, points that are like flat surfaces where we might want to place an object. And so I will go through and the process for adding a script to an entity that we have in the scene. So what I'm going to do here is take so this AR anchor entity that comes into the scene is just a blank, empty entity. There's nothing on it. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this mannequin and make it a child entity of this anchor entity. And so the plan for what's going to happen here is I'm going to script this AR anchor entity so that I can place it in the world, and it will in turn place all of its child entities under it. But this entity is what I'm going to anchor to a real world point. That's the goal. And to do that, the first thing I need to do is add a script component. Oh, I have a lot of components now. So I'm going to add a script component to that entity, and then I'm going to add a script. I think I actually never added a script quite that way, but okay. So I've added a script to that entity's script component, and if you take a look at the tutorial, we've got some. So essentially, this set of instructions is what I just went through, and so this script replaces the setup function in the script that we're creating, and I'll walk through exactly what's going on there in a second. But I'm just going to get it copied in. So I'll take the setup function, and I'm just going to replace it and get rid of that extra F. Okay, so the setup function executes when the scene starts, and what this function is going to do is register a handler for a tap on the screen, and when a tap on the screen occurs, it's going to ask ARKit to perform a hit test at that screen location. And if that hit test is successful, meaning that a real-world object, a surface, was detected at that point, we're going to anchor that point to our AR anchor entity. And after we do that, what's going to happen is that AR anchor entity will stay at that point in the world. So what this gives us the ability to do is, tap on a point on your desk and have the object snap to that position and stay there in the real world. So just to walk through the script line by line. So we're creating a new component, an AR anchor component on the entity, and then we're getting the AR system, and then setting up some handlers for performing the hit test. And all this is really doing is normalizing the screen coordinates and doing some to JavaScript math to figure out exactly what coordinates to pass into this hit test function. And basically the hit test function wants a number between 0 and 1, and usually what you get back in the event handlers are actual screen space, so 0 to 1900 or 1920 or 0 to 1080, like actual pixel coordinates. So there's just a little bit of conversion being done there. And then we call the actual hit test function on the AR system and pass in this callback, which is what's called when it's completed. And if it's completed successfully, then we call this register anchor function, which basically binds, or the result of this will bind the anchor to the point we've detected. So it's just a real simple script to perform a hit test and use the result of that to attach an entity to a point in the world.
So can you explain that? What does that mean in the actual, if you're using the app, what would a user and a customer actually be experiencing? Meaning,
so what this enables is that you tap on the screen and an object moves to the position that you tapped and stays there. So when you were doing that, so the mannequin demo you played a video of earlier, was to do that demo you were using a scene that was built with this script. And to position the mannequin where it was in that video, you probably had to tap on the floor a few times to sort of get it to move around to the position where you wanted it.
right.
So basically what this does, it gives you the ability to move a virtual object around your physical space.
Right. Cool. Thanks.
So unfortunately, I don't really have a demo of that.
Yeah. So again, and it doesn't really show that very well in the video of you placing, but to explain what it is, it's really you're viewing your real world environment, and if you want to place the mannequin or whatever entity or object you have built in your scene, you just tap on the table. There's a table here, or the floor. You tap, and it will actually, the app will, or your phone will actually detect that that's a table. It will detect that that's a floor, and it will place your object there. And you can walk around it. You can move around it 360 degrees, above, below, actually more than 360 degrees. What is that?
Sphere.
Spherical degree. That's spherical degrees. I don't think that's a term, but
Spherical degree is not a term.
yeah, it's Jake's term. But you understand my point. Like, you can move all around it like you would in the real world. And so if you want to move it, you want to put it on the table, you want to put it on the ground. And so what Mike is describing is, like with the hit test, is you want to move it, you want it to interact with the real world. That's what this script allows you to do. Is that the best way to say it, Mike?
Yeah, I think that's pretty accurate.
Great. Cool. So we've covered so far the basics of adding an app or creating an app in Sumerian, which is just using the template that you find from the dashboard. It's pretty simple. You just open up that template, add a few assets or whatever you want to do in that scene, and then you publish it, and then you can create an app using Xcode and add in that published URL into your project. So that's for iOS.
So can I interrupt you for just a second, Jake?
I suppose.
Because it seemed like there was a little bit of confusion on the chat, which I was trying to answer, but I can also speak to directly. So there are a lot of people who understood Sumerian as having the ability to allow you to create AR experiences independent of platform, whether that was Windows or Mac OS as your development platform. And so there was some confusion about why we were speaking directly to ARKit and building an app in ARKit. So what we're showing is a universal template that allows you to build AR experiences for ARKit or for AR Core, so that you can use them on AR mobile devices like iOS and Android. That's not to say that these are AR device experiences that are deployed through a browser, as Mike was talking about earlier. There are different ways of doing that. There's a framework called ARJS that allows you to do that. But then there's also the specification that the Sumerian team is working to support, which is called WebXR, which is the evolution of WebVR. And WebVR is essentially the way that we abstract interacting with virtual reality, hardware APIs, the device APIs, things like that, where you can start to use the HMD through the browser, like Jake was showing 2 weeks ago, where he was putting that on. In Chrome or Firefox, the latest versions, you can start that instance of that VR experience. So WebXR will allow for that to be possible through mobile browsers, and that's active work that we're doing right now. As I said in the chat, we've hired one of the spec writers of WebXR. Her name is Nell, and she's actively working on this project. So that's something that we recognize as being a unique area for us to work in, and something that will allow Sumerian to support all of those use cases across platforms. So, sorry to interrupt you, Jake.
That's okay. I think you covered it.
Go for it.
Okay. Actually, back to Mike.
So where do we want to go from here? I think that covers the the basic experience on the iOS side. I can jump over to the Android side. It's
there's I think a lot of people that are really interested on.
Okay. Is there any confusion? Do I need to answer are there any questions I should be answering?
I don't think so. I think we just cleared that up.
Okay.
So I guess to just jump back a second. So we showed how to do that on the iOS side. Now let's do the same thing, and I believe using the same scene, right? There's nothing needs to be done differently.
You don't have to change the Sumerian scene. All you need is where's this? Okay, the published URL, and instead, so you have that URL, and instead of using an Xcode project on your Mac to build an iOS app, you're going to use something called Android Studio, which is Google's equivalent of that, to build an Android app. And I think, as I said before, it works on Mac, Windows, Linux. It's a little bit easier to get into.
And to clarify, before you were looking at the ARKit tutorial.
Yeah, so now we're talking about AR Core. And AR Core is basically just a different framework that does very, very similar things to ARKit. So it's still internally generating its own perception of the world, and it's still giving you the ability to conduct hit tests and create anchors, that kind of thing. And it's because these APIs are so similar that we're not, we don't have to do things differently, or you don't have to do things differently when you're authoring your Sumerian scene. We've sort of handled the differences under the hood. So instead of using the ARKit starter app, there's another GitHub sample project for AR Core, which is the same name except AR Core instead of ARKit. And you can pull that project the same way I described before through from Git, either by downloading the zip or just cloning the repository. And once you have that, there's you'll just open the project file in Android Studio. I think we have a link to Android Studio and Xcode in this tutorial, and those they're free, pretty straightforward IDEs if you're familiar with development. If not, again, you really only need to change the one URL and press build to get it to work. Once you have that project open in Android Studio, what you want to do is go to this main activity file, and just like in the iOS, there's a scene URL up top, and you need to just replace that scene with your with the scene you just published, and then again, it's tough to see around this microphone. And you just want to remake and rebuild the project. I actually don't have an Android phone hooked up, so I can't deploy to anything. But that's it. That gives you the same functionality that we just went through in the iOS demo.
Yeah. So I mean, essentially, it's this. The steps are really similar. You build an app, you publish the scene, you grab that URL, and you either go down the path for ARKit or AR Core, and they're very, very similar. I think it's the best way to say it.
Yeah, I mean they're like the APIs are very similar. The way you make an app is a little bit different, just because they're different platforms. Different companies have created different IDEs, but from the samples we've created, it's really just like a one-step process of replacing a URL. And so these projects are meant as like half starter apps and half samples on how to do things. So you're not if you're more familiar with development and you have the expertise to dig in to see what's going on in here, it's not super complicated, and you can sort of figure out how to interact with the Sumerian and AR Core APIs, and so feel free to mess with things if you prefer to work differently.
We had another question just came through. Can you deploy to a Kindle Fire with the Android code sample?
I don't know. I've never tried. I don't know if Kindle Fires support AR Core. My guess would be probably not, because I think Google has started restricting features in Android away from forks. And the Kindle version of Android is a fork of Android. So I'm the question is, or the answer is, I don't know for sure. My guess would be probably not, but it would depend on whether or not Kindle support the AR Core APIs.
Cool. I think that kind of covers really the basics. I mean, there's obviously a lot more you could do in authoring an AR specific scene, which is not something we did. The point wasn't today to create a cool scene and where that is useful for AR. We just had a simple mannequin object and a video, and I can show that video again. You can add some animations and whatnot. So it's really the authoring of the scene for an AR can be very, very simple. It can be as simple as adding a box to a scene, and that's it. But then there is the building the scene using specific platforms and services that allow you to actually deploy it to either Android or iOS. Just kind of recapping what we've covered. I guess we're about at 45 minutes or so. We can hang out for a few more minutes and answer any more questions you guys might have. Sweet Games, you are, as always, asking great questions. We appreciate it. Mr. Square Peg, you're also very active. We very much appreciate that. We love all the input. And remember, and Ben has mentioned it a few times, that the Slack community is really, really great, and you can find all of us there. So if you have any more questions for Mike, I think I already posted this in the Slack community. You are AWS M*star. So if you want to find Mike, it would be at AWS. I'm going to post this right now. At AWS M*star in Slack.
Feel free to ask me questions.
No, not really. I mean, to answer a quick question, Mark from Wales, the hero markers is what ARJS has used. I've actually used them to do a demo through Twitch at the London Summit, AWS London Summit back in May. I'll be in New York this month. I'll probably do something similar on the Twitch stream as well. And so we can get you tuned in for that one. The other piece too, as I mentioned before on the chat, definitely reach out to Jerome on the Slack channel. Again, that's slack.sumerian.world. And Jake will put it in the chat. This is a place to get a hold of all of us, but Jerome, as I said, is the one who wrote ARJS, and so he can definitely give you some information around that.
Great. All right. Well, if there are no other outstanding questions, even if there are some outstanding questions, we can still answer them in Slack. But thank you, Mike, for demonstrating. Mike actually, there's some scheduling issues, and so Mike was very flexible in moving things around in order to join us today. So thank you so much, Mike.
No problem. Happy to be here.
Yeah, he's really smart. He knows what he's doing. So thank you. Great. I think that's it.
That's it. All right.
Next week is going to be our last episode for this intro series, and we're going to be covering kind of a bring it all together is what we're going to be calling it. Building a scene. It's going to be a little bit longer. It will involve some VR and some really cool stuff. So we hope you join us for our last episode of this initial series. But we plan to continue streaming and to continue the Twitch side, the Twitch community, as well as the Slack community, and just creating really cool stuff. And thank you for all your questions, everybody. Really great interaction. We appreciate it.
Also, really quickly, I am going to create a channel on the public Slack for Twitch series ideas. If there are topics that you want us to cover and things that we haven't covered in this intro series, throw it up there, let us know, and we'll be happy to take that into consideration as we plan for our next series of streams.
Cool. All right. That's a great idea. We look forward to it. All right. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Ben. We will see you next week. See you then.